Welcome back, you guys, to the 5th episode of the Holland Impact. My name is Christian Holland, and I'm super stoked to be with you guys today. Let's dive in. So last year, shortly before I went on my honeymoon, I had a book recommendation just drop into my lap, which came from one of my psychology professors who I hold a great deal of respect and admiration for. His name is Brother Devin Merritt. He is currently my industrial organizational psychology professor at Brigham Young University, Idaho. The book that he recommended was called Man's Search for Meaning, and it was written by an Austrian psychologist named Viktor Frankl. And this episode that I'm doing today is really a dedication to Viktor Frankl's life, his memory, and his survival of the Nazi concentration camp Auchwitz. I have this episode structured so I will, hopefully by the end of this episode, have accomplished 3 goals. 1, I want to teach you about who Viktor Frankl is. 2, I want to share with you what was going on inside his mind psychologically during his internment at these Nazi death camps. And 3, I want to share with you some of the lessons that he teaches in the book, some of the lessons that I've learned and taken personally, and these lessons that I think we all should incorporate into our everyday lives. So with that, here's a little introduction on Dr. Viktor Frankl. Dr. Viktor Frankl was born in Austria, and he lived from March 1905 to September of 1997. As a very early teenager, he became engrossed in psychology, even deciding to attend night classes intended for adults. And he chose to take these night classes just to satisfy his queries about the world of psychology. In 1937, Dr. Frankl opened a private practice for suicidal patients needing therapy. He took such great care of his patients, but he also tried his best to learn all he could from those people who were dependent on therapy. He became so recognized professionally that he had the opportunity to flee Germany in order to escape the Nazis' ruthlessness. And that would require him taking his pregnant wife with him to parts unknown. As a Jew, he had been taught the 10 Commandments from his youth, and they weighed heavily upon his mind, especially the 5th commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. He was caught between securing a safe life for him and his wife and his unborn child, but also staying and taking care of his mother and father. Eventually, he decided to stay and look after his parents. He allowed his visa to expire, and eventually he and his family were rounded up and sent to various Nazi concentration camps where his wife, his mother, his father, and his brother were all killed. After liberation, Viktor Frankl was devastated upon returning to his home in Vienna to find that not even remnants of his former life remained. The best thing that Dr. Viktor Frankl decided he could do for himself at that time was to return to work, which he did so. He started to reconstruct his manuscript on logotherapy, which is something that he lost to himself before the war even started. And I think I failed to mention that he developed his own school of thought in the world of psychology, and it was called logotherapy. And it's Greek for healing through meaning. And while he was writing this manuscript on logotherapy, he only devoted the first, or I think it was just one of the chapters, I don't know, it might have been the first chapter, He only devoted one chapter to his experiences in the Nazi concentration camps, but then his publisher came to him and said, "Hey, why don't you expand upon your experiences more?" So over the course of 9 days, Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. The book was originally titled Ein Psychologe erlebt das Konzentrationslager, which is German for A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp, and it was first printed and released in 1946, just a year after the end of the war. So, because he wanted to express himself freely without the looming criticism he might have for the book, he decided to publish it as an anonymous author. And you'll see that if you look up the first edition covers of the Man's Search for Meaning book, it doesn't have an author identified on the cover. So after his friends persuaded him to identify himself, Frankl came forward and accepted responsibility for writing the book. So that's just a little bit of background on the life of Dr. Viktor Frankl. So now I want to transition and share with you what he talks about as the 3 psychological stages of life as a prisoner in the Nazi concentration camps. I'm going to tune myself out and just read the quotes as they're written in the book, because I really want to be respectful and allow the words that he's written to speak for themselves. So, first of all, I'm going to read what the psychological phases are, and then I'm going to go in and share what phase it is and then read the quotes. So the first phase is called shock. The second phase is called apathy. And the third phase is called liberation. So this first quote I'm going to share, I just want to give you a little bit of context as to what's going on. So Viktor Frankl in this first quote is describing what it was like to be in line for selection. And they were being selected to either work in the camp or they were being selected to go directly to the gas chambers. And if you're unfamiliar with how those worked, I'm sorry, I don't think this is the appropriate format for me to talk about this, and I'm really just trying to be respectful to those of you who got on here, not to hear about the Nazi death camps, but to hear about how this man found the will and the strength to pursue meaning and find a drive that would carry him through this experience. So I honestly lost my train of thought. So I'm just going to go on with the quote. So this is the first phase, the first psychological phase of the prisoners in the Nazi camps. So here is what Viktor Frankl had to say about shock, the first phase. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind the movement of a man's finger, pointing now to the right and now to the left, but far more frequently to the left. It was my turn. Somebody whispered to me that to be sent to the right side would mean work, the way to the left being for the sick and those incapable of work, who would be sent to a special camp. I just waited for things to take their course, the first of many such times to come. The SS man looked me over, appeared to hesitate, then put both of his hands on my shoulders. I tried very hard to look smart, and he turned my shoulders very slowly until I faced right, and I moved over to that side. The significance of the finger game was explained to us in the evening. It was the first selection, the first verdict made on our existence or non-existence. For the great majority of our transport, it meant death. Their sentence was carried out within the next few hours. Those who were sent to the left were marched from the station straight to the crematorium. This building, as I was told by someone who worked there, had the word bath written over its doors in several European languages. On entering, each prisoner was handed a piece of soap, and then... But mercifully, I do not need to describe the events which followed. Many accounts have been written about this horror. So that was what Viktor Frankl had to say about shock. Just the unbelievability to accept that this is their new reality and that this is actually happening. It honestly sends not so great chills down my spine just thinking about what it might have been like to be there. And frankly, I don't want to find out. So here are 3 quotes about the second phase of what was going on psychologically in the mind of a camp inmate. Apathy. He says, apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. Reality dimmed, and all efforts and all emotions were centered on a single task, preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow. It was typical to hear the prisoners, while they were being herded back to camp from their work sites in the evening, sigh with relief and say, "Well, another day is over." Apathy, the blunting of the emotions, and the feeling that one could not care anymore, were the symptoms arising from the second stage of the prisoner's psychological reactions, and which eventually made him insensitive to daily and hourly beatings. By means of this insensibility, the prisoner soon surrounded himself with a very necessary protective shell. I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner, who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare. Since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffered from fearful dreams or deliria, I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly, I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him. Liberation. Viktor Frankl says, "With tired steps, we prisoners dragged ourselves to the camp gates. Timidly, we looked around and glanced at each other questioningly. Then we ventured a few steps out of camp. This time, no orders were shouted at us, nor was there any need to duck quickly to avoid a blow or a kick. This time, the guards offered us cigarettes. We hardly recognized them at first. They had hurriedly changed into civilian clothes. We walked slowly along the road leading from the camp. Soon our legs hurt and threatened to buckle. But we limped on. We wanted to see the camp surroundings for the first time with the eyes of free men. Freedom, we repeated to ourselves. Freedom. And yet, we could not grasp it. We had said this word so often, during all the years we dreamed about it, that it had lost its meaning. Its reality did not penetrate into our consciousness. We could not grasp that the fact, freedom, was ours. We came to meadows full of flowers. We saw and realized that they were there, but we had no feelings about them. The first spark of joy came when we saw a rooster with a tail of multicolored feathers. But it remained only a spark. We did not yet belong to this world. In the evening, when we all met again in our hut, one said secretly to the other, "Tell me, were you pleased today? Were you pleased at all today?" And the other replied, feeling ashamed as he did not know that we all felt similarly, "Truthfully, no." We had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly. Psychologically, what was happening to the liberated prisoners could be called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. We could not believe it was true. How often in the past years had we been deceived by dreams? We dreamt that the day of liberation had come, that we had been set free, had returned home, greeted our friends, embraced our wives, sat down at the table, and started to tell of all the things we had gone through, even of how we had often seen the day of liberation in our dreams. And then a whistle shrilled in our ears, the signal to get up, and our dreams of freedom came to an end. And now the dream had come true. But could we truly believe it? During this psychological phase, one observed that people with natures of a more primitive kind could not escape the influences of the brutality which had surrounded them in camp life. Now, being free, they thought they could use their freedom licentiously and ruthlessly. The only thing that had changed for them was that they were now the oppressors instead of the oppressed. They became instigators, not objects, of willful force and injustice. They justified their behavior by their own terrible experiences. This was often revealed in apparently insignificant events. A friend was walking across a field with me toward the camp, when suddenly we came to a field of green crops. Automatically, I avoided it, but he drew his arm through mine and dragged me through it. I stammered something about not treading down the young crops. He became annoyed, gave me an angry look, and shouted, "You don't say! And hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and child have been gassed, not to mention everything else, and you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats?" Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them. We had to strive to lead them back to this truth, or the consequences would have been much worse than the loss of a few thousand stalks of oats. I can still see the prisoner who rolled up his shirt sleeves, thrust his right hand under my nose, and shouted, "May this hand be cut off if I don't stain it with blood on the day when I get home." I want to emphasize that the man who said these words was not a bad fellow. He had been the best of comrades in camp and afterwards. One day, a few days after liberation, I walked through the country, past flowering meadows, for miles and miles, toward the market town near the camp. Larks rose to the sky, and I could hear their joyous song. There was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing but the wide earth and sky, and the lark's jubilation and the freedom of space. I stopped, looked around and up to the sky, and then I went down on my knees. At that moment, there was very little I knew of myself or of the world. I had but one sentence in mind, always the same. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. How long I knelt there and repeated this sentence, memory can no longer recall. But I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started. Step for step, I progressed until I again became a human being. So, just wow. Being able to read those quotes, and I really need to reread this book. My professor, Devin Merritt, when he recommended this book to the class, he said that this is one of the books that he will reread for the rest of his life. And after reading through it for the first time, I have to agree with him. Every chance that I get, I will share this book with whoever comes across my path. I feel like Stern, the character from Schindler's List, when he says that when they've put together the list of all the Jews that Oskar Schindler is buying to secure their freedom, Stern says, this list is life. And that's the same way I feel about this book, that this book is new life. And just from that last quote that I shared with you, that Viktor Frankl was able to overcome and push through and endure and survive, it gives me strength to conquer my own challenges and struggles, even though they pale in comparison to what he went through. So at this point in the episode, I want to wrap up and share some of the lessons from this book. The first one is one that I already touched on just recently from a quote, when he says, "Nobody has the right to do wrong, even if wrong has been done to them." You can't do something bad to someone just because that someone has done something bad to you, or just because something bad has been done to you doesn't mean you can go out of your way and exercise authority over other people just because you feel you've been wronged. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is everyone suffers, but how you react to that suffering is what matters. And along with that lesson, I want to share another quote. He says, "The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life." And I just love that, because he says you have all the power in the world, no matter the circumstances, to choose how you're going to react to whatever suffering or trial or tribulation comes your way. The next lesson is find your purpose. Escape the existential vacuum. So the existential vacuum is a phrase coined by Viktor Frankl, and he calls it the void in your life that comes from a lack of purpose and meaning. And that existential vacuum will manifest itself in the forms of anxiety, depression, addiction, and even suicide. So that lesson teaches me, find a meaning, latch onto it. And what he says at the very beginning about apathy being a self-defense mechanism, don't be apathetic where you turn off your feelings just because you find yourself in a really, really tough situation. He says all your efforts, all your emotions were centered on a single task, when he's referring to the second stage of the second psychological phase in the mind of a camp inmate. He says, preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow. And I don't know why, but the lyrics to the Tim McGraw song Humble and Kind is coming to my mind. He says, don't take for granted the love this life gives you, where you get where you're going. When you found your meaning, don't forget to turn back around and help the next one in line. Find a meaning, latch onto it, find a purpose. And once you found it and latched onto it and found success and fulfillment in that, you turn around and you help another person. And that becomes your purpose. And lastly, the title of this podcast episode is called The Depths of the Human Soul. And that comes from another quote from the book. He says, life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. Life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. You know what I think that means? It means it showed the world, it showed each camp inmate who went through that and survived what they are truly made of. One of the very last lines in the book reads, "Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of." I believe what Dr. Frankl is trying to say is twofold. One, we know what horrible atrocities man is capable of committing to each other. But we also know, and this is number two, we also know that man is divinely resilient. Just like neuroplasticity allows the brain and the nervous system to rewire, restructure, and reorganize, literally fix itself in response to experience and injury, humankind is able to go through horrendous, traumatic experiences and eventually bounce back from it, stronger and more motivated. So I want to end the episode by saying, if you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl, it needs to be at the top of your to-read list. You need to read this book before you die. It is a wonder and it is a masterpiece. And there is something in there that will touch the hearts of all who read it. What that something is, that's up for you to find out. So until next time, my name is Christian Holland, and you're listening to the Holland Impact. Thank you, guys.